Towards the end of last week, I read that 2 priests were convicted of theft in the United States. They stole $8 million. One was 81 and the other 66. And they spent the money on cars and girlfriends and the like. Now, my question is, what does God do? Does he not audit? And the other part of the question is, who created God? Was it not man who created God in his own image and not the other way around? Thank you.
Okay, well, we'll take the other, but clearly they didn't have a regulator to check up on those priests and their use of cash.
Eugene Wigner appealed to the idea of God as an ultimate observer to put an end to the infinite regress of observers required to have collapsed the waveform of another observer who has observed the cat in the box or whatever. However, the omnipresence of a divine observer would cause the waveform to collapse everywhere throughout space and time. We, on the other hand, observe that we do in fact have indeterminacy. The waveform is not collapsed. Should we not conclude that there is no divine observer?
When God gives the gift of free will, it is a dangerous gift and it will be abused. And it can be abused by religious people and non-religious people. And the example you quoted is a bad example of religious abuse of free will. Who made God? To ask that question is, if I may respectfully say so, is not to fully understand the concept of God. The concept of God includes the idea that God is a being who possesses what the theologians call aseity, that is to say, being in itself. God does not depend on any other source of being for God's existence. Now, there may or may not be such a being. I think it's a coherent possibility that there is such a being. And therefore, if there is a God, the question of who made God is actually is a mistaken concept of God. God is a universal observer who collapses the wave function everywhere to disastrous effects. That is, again, a little bit of a mistake, I think, about God. That is to think of God as being an operative player simply in the processes of creation itself. I said a little bit earlier this evening that God is not an invisible creature among creatures in the world. God has a different relation to creation. God holds that in being. God knows all that can be known, and God knows about the realities of quantum theory, but God, again, allows quantum entities to enjoy their somewhat veiled and often indeterminate existence, if that is what the divine will has been expressed in terms of quantum physics. So God is not the universal observer in some physical sense.
I think I'd just like to add, we try to suggest that from a philosophical point of view, you can think of God as the ultimate creator, or the loving ultimate creator. And by definition, an ultimate creator can't have been created. On the business of God's intervention, it's a little bit like, if I may say so, what I was doing with those molecules. I set those molecules going. I was not myself a molecule. Now, being very fallible and unlike God, I then pressed the wrong button and the molecules behaved in an undesirable way. And if the point is simply God could, if he chose, stop the universe at any point and wind it up, that's essential to the doctrine of creation. But God, unlike me not being incompetent, once he chooses to endow a universe with the ability to have free will creatures who are going to love, knows when to step back and isn't going to be doing the things that cause the universe to collapse. That doesn't mean to say that he doesn't interact with his universe at all, but he does it on his terms and in his way. By the way, I want to rerun that experiment afterwards for any skeptics so that you can really see that this does happen.
Check, yes. Well, it's my great privilege to thank our two speakers for two fascinating and very different approaches to these questions. And I want to thank them in the best way I can, which is by showing they've stimulated some questions in me, which they may well answer. But a focus in both presentations was the dangers of a reductionist view of science. And I think these are very considerable. We haven't explored them fully, but they are very considerable. And perhaps I'll illustrate one or two of those ways. And one may think, well, no, nobody's as naive as that. But actually, a cell biologist, someone whom I deeply respect and like, was being quoted in the papers at the weekend saying we are nothing but a collection of cells. And that's, this was a very distinguished scientist. Now, I actually think there's something deeply flawed in such a view, and I should put my position on the table. I'm a bog standard agnostic, actually, but that includes agnosticism about the overripe claims for science. If what he means by saying that is that there are no other material elements observable by the technologies of science in a human being, well, that's an empirical point he's making, which will be tested through the technologies as they develop, that perhaps the material objects of which we are comprised are cells, full stop. Very naive, but it's at least testable. If, however, what he means is that at core, human beings are no different from material objects, I think there are deep and dangerous consequences of that remark. I mean, at the facetious end, if you're Jack the Lad about town and you see somebody that you'd like to take out on a date, and your opening gambit is, "That's a magnificent disposition of cells I see before me," well, I think you're a sad case for a number of reasons. One is that you actually have no sense of what human attraction is, an attraction to a human being. I think, secondly, you have no sense of what it is to communicate between one human being and another. And I think, further, the prospects of a date are zero. Now, these are all good reasons for saying, well, there are limits to this approach. And that's the point I'm making in a facetious way. In other ways, of course, to treat human beings as if they were simply material objects goes against every instinct and every sense of justice that we have. And this is the broader point that I want to make. If you construct a view of the world, including a view of human beings, which is that they are only material objects, then I think all of the normal relationships that we have are impossible. And what's more, you have a theory that, or a hypothesis that may be very useful empirically in certain areas of scientific inquiry. In fact, I think it is. But if it's a hypothesis on which you base your interactions within civil society, then it will fail very badly indeed. The point was made over here, and I think both our speakers have made it. It will not take account of a sense of being responsible for your actions. A very dubious account of what it is to be in love with someone, or actually to hate someone, perhaps for good reason. It certainly doesn't allow for the possibility that I can act in such a way that I regret afterwards, or possibly that I'm pleased about afterwards. I mean, pride and shame are two sides of a coin. And so what I'm saying is that view of what human beings are like is simply not adequate to life. And I can give you lots of references to philosophers who have written about this, particularly Peter Strawson. And that's one of the huge limitations. And I'll just finish with what I think is one of the other limitations of science as an account of everything that there is. The question that some would dismiss as meaningless or irrelevant, but why is there anything at all? And that, it seems to me, is not a foolish question. Perhaps one is struggling to articulate, but it is a fundamental question that I do not see ever being answered within the current constraints of scientific inquiry, which has to do with relationships between whatever there is within the world in which we live. Hence, my reasons for actually being with these guys in saying we really have good reason to be concerned about a view of science that is so reductionist and materialist, and then perhaps with a lot of room for debate and argument, which we've been having about, well, what else is necessary, and how do you constitute and validate and authenticate all the languages that we need to have normal human concourse. But having said that, can I thank them very much, and I'm sure you will want to as well.